Well, good morning, all you dudes. And ladies. It's 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, August the 18th, I guess it is. And this is Lancaster Woodturners Weekly Coffee Hour. My name's John Kelsey. I'll be host this morning. This morning we have a special guest star, an old friend of mine, Albert LeCoff, who I'm going to put a spotlight on right now so I can do a very brief introduction, and I'll tell you why that will be in a minute. There we go. Um, Albert's slideshow is mostly about his amazing life and career as the leading curator, gallerist, organizer in this field in ways that are as yet unimagined. Albert has done so much for this field over the last 50 years. It is just unbelievable. I first met Albert in, I think it was 73 or 4, probably 74. I was a student at RIT. I was the only one in the class interested in lathe work. Albert came up selling wood with an old dude named Ed Ray, and he was looking for some, well, could I just hang out in the wood shop here? Maybe somebody will do some wood turning. And we had a wonderful time turning wood. And then he said, well, we should do more of this. And before I knew it, he'd organized the first ever wood turning symposium a few months later at the George School, which of course I went to. And that led inevitably, 10 years later, to the foundation of the AAW, and that led inevitably a few years later to the founding of the Woodturning Center, which is now the Center for Art and Wood in Philadelphia. And along with that, the Collectors of Wood Art, which have changed their name again, I don't know to what. But all of that, the origins of all of these organizations that we all now rely on, all go back to my dear old friend Albert LeCoff. And with that, I'm going to give the floor to Albert, and I'm going to let's see, make the spotlight off me right now, and remove that spotlight. Put the spotlight on Albert. Albert, you got it. I'll start your slides anytime you're ready.
Great. Well, you can put the first one up. Thank you for that introduction, and it doesn't take much for me to realize it. There's people like John that have played critical roles in my life in doing what I'm doing. So I like to acknowledge a lot of those people that are on this Zoom chat that have been part of my life. And okay, so Merrill asked me why or what is game changers, and I really believe that through life you meet people that change and help you in your career and give you direction. So that's what my talk is going to be about. So I was extremely fortunate in being exposed to woodworking from elementary school all the way through high school. And I am a true turner in all definitions of the word. I was a wood turner and I was a turner gymnast. This is a picture of me on the right competing in gymnastics in high school. And on the left are pictures of candlesticks that I made in high school. Wow. And I didn't realize how challenging they were because they were long and I didn't have a steady rest. What was unique about my high school teacher, Brubacher, was that in the middle of the room, he would have a pile of books. And he said, you can use these books as sources of inspiration for techniques or designs, but do not copy anything. You must change at least one element of an object that you're trying to recreate from a book. And that had a lasting effect on everything that I did and do in life. Next slide, please. So I served a 2-year apprenticeship with an Israeli woodturner who was living in Philadelphia, and going back to Israel, he felt that he needed to identify a turner, as he said, that peeled the wood, not scraped the wood, that his clients could go to. He couldn't find one, so on a handshake agreement, we decided to work together. And I always wanted to learn by working with a master. So we worked together for 2 years. And one really good way of learning turning is through production turning. So he would give me jobs that were too minimal for him. And one of them was turning these scoops handles. And I must have turned thousands of those. And they all had to be the same length with the same taper that went into the scoop. and there are 3 scribed lines around the handle. So that was a way for him to teach me production turning and the use of the tools. And my major mentor in life was Stephen Hogben, who,
Can't
John, you
get
introduced me
my
to.
audio to work.
Oh, just a minute. Whoever you are who's talking about your audio, you have to mute your audio.
What intrigued me about Stephen's work is realizing that when you cut something apart, you have a new profile to see. And these are 3 good examples of the use of that technique that Stephen developed. On the upper left are salad servers, which he turned for 2 main reasons. One, it was a production item, which he just had to turn them and then cut them on a bandsaw and put a rubber band around them, and he would put a tag on it identifying the type of wood and the price. And he did that to find out how that type of wood worked. The bottom left, if you can imagine that split in half down the center and re-glued it on the rims, that was the original bowl that he turned. And through that simple concept of cutting a bowl in half and then re-gluing it on the other rim, you get a totally different shape. The one on the right is from his walking bowl series, a very complex way of turning and reassembling, which I felt could be a maquette for a sculpture in a city square where you could walk underneath that piece and water coming down the object. A lot of things in turning could be maquettes for larger work. Next slide, please. So what I want to show you is that I was actual turner, and I always like to visit artists that I was considering to teach at those early symposiums. So I went up to Stephen's shop, and this is me turning at his lathe. And I had a commission for a pedestal. And I was a pretty cocky turner. I was really skilled. I could turn a newel post in 25 minutes. And I felt that I could turn this spindle maybe in an hour and a half. But 3 days later, I finished it. And what I didn't realize was the difference in turning a mass, a very large object, and turning it very slow to get it round. So I'm going to take you through the process of what I did with that turning. And this is it off the lathe. And the next slide shows me separating the piece in the 4 equal elements, and then rearranging it. And what I was concerned about was the negative space. In other words, the space that's in between the wood. And what does that symbolize? So the next slide shows it put together in the arrangement that I wanted it. This was a commission for a tzedakah box, which is a charity box in a synagogue. And the money goes to help people. So I felt that if you're going to give money to people, the pedestal should represent a person and an empty form. So that's what that empty space is. Now, what's interesting is the tzedakah box is very valuable. So they would lock it up when they weren't using it, but they left the pedestal out. And this is where I believe that functional objects can be sculpture in their own place. And this is at the dedication of the event. And what happened is what I was hoping is that people were reaching inside the form to see what it was. And in fact, one kid got his head stuck inside, which is pretty funny. But I remember making this piece for this space. And I took the object to the synagogue and I mixed up the stains that would match, the exterior would match the pews, which were made out of mahogany, and the inside a gold that would reflect the eternal light that was at the ark. So I remember taking this home and staining it, and it just looked awful. And I covered it. I thought I ruined the piece. And then I realized that I had made the stain for the space. So when I took the piece back to the room, it fit perfect. So I was really happy with it. The next object is an example of bowl turning or faceplate turning. And in this case, I didn't want to lose the space that I would lose from a solid block when I cut it up. So I took these boards that were bolted together. Now, can you imagine that spinning around with bolts in each corner holding it together? But again, I knew what the cross section was going to be for the final object. And I'll take you through playing around that form.
Albert, what year are we talking about here?
We're talking about 1977.
Okay.
And I'm turning on Jack Hansen's lathe, which is a fabulous bowl lathe and a great tool rest, which was the weakest part of Stephen's lathe. He did not have a good tool rest. So the next slide, you see the object split apart in the center, then rearranged, and you see that it shows the Star of David. And the next one, I reassembled or spread out the form to show that there were parallel or equal elements on both sides of that turning. And then on the right, it shows it assembled as a lectern, showing the evolution of the Star of David. This is a commission that my mother gave me to honor my father. And I wanted to show the evolution of the star because I felt the speaker was developing a thought. So that's the purpose of the shape of the form. There's a walnut setback behind the star, which allows light to come through it, which highlights the negative space.
I can't help note your haircut.
Yeah, my afro. Then on the encouragement of John, as he mentioned, visiting RIT, with my brother and Palmer Sharpless, we organized a series of wood turning symposiums. And they were based on a very simple concept of sharing. And the idea was, I knew people would want to come because they wanted to see a certain person. And at the beginning, there were 5 instructors. And to make sure that everybody experienced each person and learn something unexpected, after the initial morning of presentations by each of the instructors to the group was broken up into smaller groups, and they rotated to each instructor where they were given individual instruction. And on the left, you see Frank Cummings in the foreground. And in the way back, you see Skip Johnson. And that's a typical layout at the George School. On the right is a picture of, starting on the right, Palmer Sharpless, and then Paul Eshelman, then my brother, twin brother Alan, who was my partner in not just a symposium, but everything I do in life, and myself and Paul Eshelman's wife. And the way background is Paul Eshelman's, or Palmer's son. And the next one, Palmer also in his shop had a pile of books that we looked through during the symposium. And in 1978, I remember distinctly Alan Sturt and I going through the books, and we found this book by Reibhorn, and it was his thesis paper from 1970. And we went through the pictures, and we saw these pictures of bowls that we thought were stock sales, but they're attributed to a fellow by the name of James Prestini, who we didn't know about. So that was my first introduction to James Prestini, who I was fortunate to meet later on in life. But again, the value of books. And early on, Donna Mylock created a series of books. And it was in one of her books that I saw this piece by Frank Cummings. And I swore it was clay. But as I read the description, it was wood, heavily textured, with a combination of horsehair. And it was probably the first turned object that I'd ever seen that was so heavily carved and exotic materials added to it. And that's why I got a hold of Frank. It was through that book. And later on, he became an instructor, as I showed.
You want to have a pause for questions? If anybody's, let's just have a little look at the gallery and see if we got any burning questions out there. Questions or comments, or we let them go ahead?
I'd ask, this is Ernie Conover, I'd ask Albert, I think James, we had an early symposium in Philadelphia, I think.
Yes.
And James Prestini came to that, I thought. And I remember him and Rudy Aselnik talking for quite a while and sort of a mutual admiration society.
That was the 1988 symposium, the second symposium held in Philadelphia. And I organized a panel discussion between Rudy Aselnik, Mel Lindquist, Bob Stockdale, and James Prestini. And I've got a great picture of them. But I asked them to come because we also did the ITOS exhibition, which featured his work. And so you're correct, he was at one of the symposiums. You have to realize that he only turned between 1933 and 53. And he was really a designer. At each of the symposiums, we had an instant gallery where each of the participants and the instructors were given areas where they could lay out their work. And what I wanted to show in this particular slide is the quality of the work made at that time. And also some people brought historical objects. And in the left-hand foreground, you see a painted saffron container that was made by Joseph Long Lane. And that must have been from the 1800s. And I'll refer back to that work later on. But that's some of the work that was brought to the symposium during those years. In 1981, we had our last symposium, and I thought that there was so much growth in the field that we knew about, but the field didn't know about and the public didn't know about. So I decided to organize one last symposium where, first of all the past instructors were invited to come to meet each other, because I was the only one who was fortunate to meet everybody. And I organized the first North America Turned Object Show, documented in this book, A Gallery of Turned Objects. And this is a picture of John with David Ellsworth on the left and me between them, discussing Bruce Mitchell's piece. And I have to give a lot of credit to John for really creating editorial content, not just for the field of turning, but for woodworking in general, by being the first editor of Fine Woodworking. And it was in the second Fine Woodworking magazine that he highlighted the symposium. And he did a fabulous review of this exhibition of Gallery Turned Objects and the final exhibition that you should get a hold of. And I think that really put the show in context.
Well, I was trying to establish a way of talking about this work. And yeah, that essay is available. I probably will post it along with this at some point.
Great. Well, as I mentioned, that show, all the instructors were invited to put into up to 3 pieces. And this was the type of work that was being done. Rudy Aselnik on the left, obviously, he was great in experimenting with new material. And in the 70s, plywood was a new material, which I don't know if any other turner attempted to use. because if you ever tried to use it, you know there's a lot of glue in those layers of wood to make up plywood. What's unique about this piece of Rudy's is in between each layer of like 3/4 inch plywood, he inserted a piece of walnut veneer. And the bullseye that I refer to, that shape that is revealed on the outside, is totally determined by the profile of the bowl. So you end up with an oval line around the vessel. The piece on the right, I think, is one of the finest Ellsworth pieces, going through a natural opening in the wood. But in this case, the pith of the wood is going sideways. This piece was highlighted in the exhibition of wood turning in North America since 1930. And I remember acquiring this piece directly from David. I visited him, and it was on my way. Actually, I'd go down to see Dale Nish, and he and I went down to Dale to convince him to do the book. But I remember buying this piece. I was all ready to buy a stereo when I got back home from Philly, from that trip. But the money went to buy this piece. And I said, I can always buy a stereo, but I can't buy a piece that sings like this. So David, thanks for that. I did end up buying a stereo, but that's proudly in my possession. Destined to go to the center, I believe. Next slide. Also about that show, it gave artists the first opportunity to be in a turning exhibition. And I venture if you can guess who made these objects. These three people, it was their first exposure in a major exhibition. So do we have any guesses? If we don't, I'll start.
Yeah, that doesn't look like you got any guesses.
All right, the left one is Michael Hoslick. The right is Michelle Holsephal. And the bottom left, which I think is one of the most innovative turnings I've ever seen, is Michael Broley, that he made while he was a graduate student. And the top, the lid, which is called a split lid container, is a different wood than the base. And if you notice, there's a space between the two pieces that are connected by the handle. When you rotate the piece to get the grains to be perpendicular to each other, the grain becomes tighter in one direction, which locks the piece into place, which is why that space is there, pulls the lid together. So he really knew about movement of wood and design. And I said, this is a future star. If you go to the next slide, you'll see examples of these three artists. Michael Hoslick on the upper left, very innovative use of turning, texturing, and coloring and making these pair of tables. And Michelle Holsephal upper right, which I'll explain later, that she uses a lathe really to rough out a form and then take it off the lathe to do a lot of hand carving. And Michael's is all turned elements that he was inspired by Stephen Hogbin in rearranging the elements. So even the bat was turned, but cut apart and reassembled. This is called Mother's in the Balance, and Mother Nature in the Balance. And if you remove the bat, the plant falls. And it was his comment on the misuse of the rainforest, where man was destroying the plants and therefore destroying the animals. And this one, yes.
Albert, in this period of time, did you visit most of these shops as well?
I was just thinking that yes, I visited that, a lot of the artists, and I've got great pictures of me visiting Rudy back in the in the mid 70s. And I met David purely by accident. I went to Rudy's or to Colorado to visit a friend. And after 3 days, got bored and wanted to do some turning. And everybody said I have to visit this guy, David Ellsworth. So yes, I did visit a lot of the artists. And also in that show, it showed some amateurs and also furniture makers that were using the lathe. The piece on the left by Hugh Wessler is a razor cabinet that is about 30 inches tall, and it opens up to be a cabinet, glass shelves, and the razor opens up to be a cabinet.
Well, the only turn part of that is the base, right?
Yes, turned and then textured. Yes, the top wasn't turned, but a major element was, and that was accepted, of course, in the show. And Robert Street, who was an architect, hobbyist woodturner from Seattle, created this ghost goblet, which a lot of us felt should have been best of show. I just don't understand how he was able to turn this so thin and look like it just melting or evolving from the base.
I actually have that goblet right here in my hand, and I'll show it a little later, or I have the mate to it.
Great. Also in the show, I felt were real game changers. Showed really how advanced some artists were. The piece on the left was Giles Gilson's Hopi Indian calendar jar vessel, which is now in the collection of LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And each one of those circles represents a month in the calendar of the Hopi harvest season. And that won a special award. Now, can you imagine the knowledge and the mathematics that you would need to determine that you would get to that shape once you turned it? And probably in that piece, you can see every type of polychromatic turning that exists.
That's about a foot across, isn't it?
Yeah. And Merrill is called Jelly Doughnut. And this was extremely controversial among the turners at the symposium, because all they could think about was that piece is going to fall apart because you can't glue wood and acrylic. But I always like to think what a lot of California artists would tell people who said things like that. Well, I've got a good picture of it. So Merrill, maybe you want to say something more about that piece, but I thought it was very innovative.
I think my giant barbells were in the show also.
Yes.
So this piece has not fallen apart ever. It's at the Mint Museum.
Yes.
It's polyester resin, and the barbells went to the Smithsonian. So I did well off of your show, Albert.
Well, eventually they realized how great it was. And I could have shown your barbells. And let me tell you, I could do a show on each one of these or
Right.
topics.
Marilyn Albert, how big is the donut? I remember it being about 18 inches across. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think it might be a little bit smaller, something like 14 inches and 3 inches thick. And what's interesting is that is poplar, but I had such beautiful poplar that it all turned brown on the edge. So I could also play with the wood pattern in gluing this up. This was part of a series I did using those giant wheels. I did a cabinet, I did 3 lamps, I did the barbells.
Yeah.
I just got carried away playing with Tinker Toys.
You can tell us all about that when you come on our show.
Yeah, I'm
in
gonna be here next month.
next month's guest
Yep.
star. So we'll see all those slides then, I hope.
Right. Yeah.
Merrill,
So,
that piece is 14 inches in diameter.
yeah.
I just looked it up.
Oh, okay. Better than I can.
Back to you, Albert.
Okay, next slide. Also in the show was the work of Jake Brubacher, and he was a early instructor at the symposium. He was a Mennonite priest in Lancaster, where I met. And I refer back to Joseph Long Lane's piece. And his grandfather started turning these saffron containers to supplement his income as a farmer. And then Jake learned this from his father and his grandfather and taught his son and grandson. And he would traditionally give these to couples that he would marry, and filled with saffron, which is a very expensive spice. And I remember at the symposium, I put my arm around him in the middle of the group and I said, Jake, you've learned this from your father and grandfather. You've taught your son and your grandson, and they all have the same acorn top and the same stem in the bottom. The only thing that changes is the middle. Don't you think you can loosen up a little bit? So the following year, he presented me with a piece on the right, which is the same container, but on an angle, and it is hollow, and it still has the same acorn top and the stem base, but it has a tail. And now everybody wonders whether their saffron containers have hidden tails in them. But it showed me that you're never too old to do something new.
What I remember about Jake Brubacher in those years is the cup on the left, the walnut one. He turned that, or one like that, with a single tool, and that was a file with the tang bent into a hook tool for hollowing, the other end sharpened as a scraper for shaping, and a drill bit welded onto the center of it.
Right.
Jake Brubacher.
And his homemade screw chuck, which was in hot demand after he demonstrated it. You have to remember, this is the 70s, and there wasn't the advancement in tool technology as there is today, which I think I attributed to the symposiums.
Absolutely. You created it.
Now, most people think of the grandfathers of turners, and I always like to show the image of these people when they're not necessarily at work really reflects their attitude toward turning. And on the upper left, you have James Prestini, who's wearing his white shirt and tie. He's a designer at the drafting table, drawing out the forms that he's going to make on the lathe. On the right is Bob Stockdale. Now, he had two lathes, one to turn his hand-sized bowls, and the other one for his large salad bowls. So this is on his large salad bowl, large lathe with one of his extremely large bowls. The bottom left is a very important image, not just of Rudy, but of Daphne in the background. They were a team. They worked together in creating Hoslick Originals and having the gallery benchmark. And Rudy would turn all the work and Daphne would finish all the work. When Daphne died, Rudy dropped the name Hoslick Originals and started signing all his work, Rudy Hoslick, the year and the materials. So that's how you can tell who did the work. In the middle, there's a great picture of Mel Lindquist out in the forest, looking at the wood, determining in the raw material what he was going to turn or make. And this shows that he's very much influenced by the nature of the wood itself. In the raw
Mel is the guy who brought spalted wood to everyone's attention. Nobody would ever turn that before Mel came along.
Right, right. And on the right is just a fabulous picture of Ed Moulthrop on his homemade faceplate lathe, turning this goblet. And I've got another picture of him sitting inside this goblet. And he was an architect who did turning as an avocation until he was making more money as a turner than he was as an architect. And this is examples of those artists' work. James Prestini's work always had the outside form echoed the inside, which meant that the foot, there was really like a rocking foot or a very small foot, if there was any. On the right is a classical Bob Stockdale, who most people believe introduced the idea of adding a foot to a turned object. The bottom left is what I call a Rudy Solnick natural edge bowl. This is a natural edge, but it was created by the scrap wood from a veneer mill. And for veneer mills to get more wood from the log, they would cut the flare, the bottom of the tree where it flared out to the roots. They would cut that off to make a longer log so they get a longer piece of veneer. And they considered that scrap wood. And Rudy got all that wood for free. And he would turn out the bowl inside and out and leave the natural edge, which was created by the chainsaw mark. And here in the middle, you see Mel's piece, which shows all the natural characteristics of the raw material, the bark inclusion and the natural edge. And on the right, this piece might be around 20 or 24 inches in diameter of Ed Moulthrop's. Next slide. I really consider Rudy as a great example, and he preached that you've got to make more than one object to make a living, and you can't count on your $10,000 pieces to make a living. You should have a production item, and he proudly stated that he probably made enough of these candlesticks to cover a football field. But there's his laminated plywood bowl, his natural edge spur bowls, his bud vases on the bottom left, and his very functional laminated rolling pins. And we come to Merrill, and Merrill, I really feel that you probably explored earlier than anybody else in the turning field the use of texture and pattern. And these are really great examples of that. And I can't wait for your Zoom session next week where you can expand on these, or next month, I believe. Maybe you want to say more about these two objects.
No, I think you should do your talk and I'll talk next time.
Great. Okay. Up next then. It's the work of Bill Hunter. Now, the piece up on the upper left is from his Fathoms series. And he accidentally turned through one of his vessels and he thought he ruined it. But he realized it was an opportunity that he could create openings in his vessels. So that started this whole series of fluting and negative space. And one day he had a further accident where he broke through and there were pieces laying on the table and he thought he ruined it. But then he realized that he could play with those broken elements, which he ended up making these forms that are interlocking. They are not glued together. So the owner can rearrange that any way they want.
What year is this, Albert?
This is probably
Mid 80s?
mid to late 80s.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a guy I worked with. He used to say, if you can't fix it, feature it.
You got it.
Is Bill still working, Albert?
Yes, he is. And he does collaborative work with his wife, Mary Ann, who's a jeweler. This is Mark Lindquist's work. As most people know, he uses a chainsaw quite a bit, several ways in creating texture on his forms. And this is a picture of the chainsaw attached to the tool rest of the lathe, using robotics to index the chainsaw to texture the vessel early on. The piece on the left was purposely stained copper to look like a bronze color to see what it would look like if it was done in bronze. And he decided not to do it in bronze. But what he learned when he did core turning, which is a process of cutting out the inside of a vessel to save the wood to make something else, that a unique pattern was generated. So in this trunk of a tree where he cored out the center, he has this beautiful pattern that was left from the chainsaw. Now, if you notice on the rim, there is this maze-like pattern that he also created. And I like to ask people, why do you think he created that maze?
Anybody?
Bug holes.
Exactly. The bug hole texture that was on the exterior, he said, well, you can do your work, and this is my work. He always honored the natural flaws in a piece of wood, which is especially highlighted in this piece. And in the next piece I'm going to show you.
Just a sec though, that piece that in the upper left is in the exhibition space on the mezzanine of the center in Philadelphia. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention that.
And this is a piece that I proudly own. And this is when I realized I was a collector, because it took me 3 years to pay it off. This piece of walnut, Mark received from Ed Multhrop, realizing that he couldn't use it. And the very top of it is natural. It's the mark that was left by the sawyer after he cut the tree and allowed the tree to break off from the trunk, which creates this mohawk effect on the right. And he left that, which is really quite beautiful. And the rest of it, he made on the lathe, starting with the top, using a chainsaw like a paintbrush. He scalloped the edge to create this beautiful random freedom pattern around the edge. The main body of the piece has a herringbone texture, which was created as the piece was slowly being rotated against a router, and the router was vibrating on the piece to create that pattern. And using architectural turned elements, that pedestal was created by simply insetting or turning a smaller section to create a pedestal for the piece.
How tall is this?
That's about 30 some inches too.
And what year are we talking about here?
1985. Todd Hoyer is also well known for making very emotional, reflective pieces. This is from his X series, where the three elements on the left, three vessels, were all turned on different axes. But the X marks were created using a chainsaw, where he cut through the element or the vessel to reveal the inside. It was a very tough time in his life where he was dealing with personal problems, and he felt that he had developed some pieces that reflected that. The piece on the right was roughly turned and then hand carved, and then a proponent of using wire to wrap around the piece to look like it's squeezing the form. And he's from Bisbee, Arizona. Or I also want to mention, whenever you see his work, if you go back to the other slide, any cracks that you see, there will never be another crack. And that he believes that something should be totally dried before it's sold. And he will work on a piece for sometimes up to a year and burying the piece in the ground to let it dry. And so the piece is thoroughly dried and the cracks are natural, which he respects. Next slide. This is the work of Michelle Holsephal. As I mentioned, all her work is made on a lathe initially. Here's a picture of her using a lathe that she inherited from her father, which is a machinist lathe, where the cutting tool is held in a chuck and is moved by two wheels in three different axes. So you really have to be multidexterous and be able to move the tool to create the shape. And as I mentioned, we'll start with the self-portrait of the hand. That piece it's one piece of wood. The interior of the bowl was turned on the lathe, and the exterior was turned down to the fingertips and possibly roughed out to the hand, to the wrist, leaving the burl. Now that was originally a piece of wood that had a burl on both ends, which was given to her by her husband, David. And several times she was going to cut it in half to make two burls. And David said, no, don't do that. There's a piece in there for you. And eventually she realized that it was going to be the self-portrait. And the other pieces are great examples of rough turning and the illusion of it being several pieces of wood, but it's created by texturing and smooth carving to give the illusion of multi-layered wood. Skip Johnson really noted for his humor. This is called Floor Walker, the piece on the right. Great use of spindle turning where it really looks like those feet could move. That's in the center's collection. And it's one of my favorite pieces that I acquired for the center. I acquired the piece on the left because it reminds me, my wife is much prettier, but she loves coffee and she loves beer. So that's in our house, and it has a cabinet in the base. The next piece is Betty Scarpinos, and this is the first piece or the largest piece that she made. It was during her residency program at the Center's International Turning Exchange, which has been renamed recently to the Wingate Wood Arts Residency Program. A fabulous use of the lathe to come to a rough form, and then using hand tools to carve out the texture and the smooth surfaces. And this is the same piece, but different sides.
What years, when are we talking about here?
Betty, you're on the line. I think this was 2006.
I think this coincides with the time when Betty was editor of the Journal, or very close to it.
Yes, great contributor to the field. Besides her work as a wood turner, wood sculptor, but being an editor and a writer for our field. Michael Hoslick, I really refer to as someone like Rudy Solnick, who makes so many different things utilizing the lathe. Great humorous rattles on the upper left, and his tables on the lower left, and his very functional, beautiful candlesticks on the bottom right, and his boat of forms of strange fruit. Haley Smith, who was a resident at our first International Turning Exchange in 1995. This was her, this is an interesting story on the left. Up until that time, and I think today, she only uses like 1 inch thick maple. And I used to supply the artists with the materials that they wanted to use. And I mistakenly ordered, I think 3 inch maple. And it was the first time she turned something that thick. So this is a great example of a bowl form, a hemisphere form with different textures that she created on the form.
How did she create those textures, Albert? Do you know?
A Dremel tool. So each one of those marks are hand done with a Dremel tool, and great use of color on the right and geometric forms on the stars in our field. Now, at this time, 1986, two organizations developed And I was on a committee to help form the AEW, and this was in 1985 at Aramount, where a group of us felt that there should be a group that represents the turning field. And that's where the AEW formed and began. And it was during that early year that I realized that the AEW was really going to push for the amateur turner and the new turners and how to. And I wanted to push the professional side and do major exhibitions and symposiums for discussion and scholarship rather than just how to. So I developed the Woodturning Center at that time, whose mission was education, preservation, and promotion. And of course, both organizations exist and they have evolved today into a different organ. Just a minute. The center now of the Center for Art and Wood. Now, from 1976 to 2000, I operated the center out of my home, and then Tina in my home. And on the left, you see me on our home on Coulter Street, where this is after a turning class I gave to a group of students, proudly holding up the spindles that they had turned with the teacher in the lower right. And on the right is my living room, or our living room, Tina and my living room, with examples of what would eventually become the center's collection. Now, even though the center wasn't existed at that time in 1986, I felt, and other people felt, that I was eventually going to develop an institution. So that's how a lot of pieces were acquired in those early years. In 1985, I was asked by the Craft Alliance to do an exhibition on wood turning. And I said I'll do it under 3 conditions. One, that there'll be established and emerging artists. 2, that it wouldn't be a wood turning show, it would be a turning show. And that's because you can turn other materials on the lathe, like metal, and do metal spinning. So I included metal turners in that exhibition. And the other is I felt the field was really stagnant, that they were really making work that the collectors were pleased with. So I challenged each artist to make a new piece, irregardless of the marketplace. So each piece was brand new. And at the opening, which is a picture of me on the left, with Ed Moulthrop and Todd Hoyer in the back, it was a huge success. A lot of pieces were sold, and Barbara Oakham, that had another gallery in St. Louis, was on the phone with her collector saying that you should buy these pieces. And she said to one collector, you wouldn't go too far wrong to buy the whole show. You'd have an instant exhibition collection of what the field's all about. And it wasn't until the 4th symposium, when the center took it over, the 4th challenge series, that we developed our first book.
Do you want me to stay back there?
Yeah, no, this is good. No, go back to the other one. And through those challenge shows, you got really innovative work. And I remember Alan Sturt during the Gulf War telling me that that war affected him so much that he could not turn. He couldn't make work until one day he decided he could work. But the first piece he would make would be reflective of his feelings about how bad war is, that it kills the spirit of individuals and objects. So he turned this beautiful bowl, which he took a torch to create these openings, to create War Bowl, which he went on to make a series. The piece on the right is Dewey Garrett's to reflect 9/11 and one the World Trade Center buildings falling down. Next. And one of the great collaborative work that was in the challenge series was this piece by Neil Donovan and John Verheyen. And they often did work together and did trips together. And one day they were traveling through the countryside and passed this lake that had a forest next to it. It was a winter time, and there were people skating on the rink and beautiful reflection of the forest. And they went home and they decided they have to depict this story of this lake. And this is a 30-inch diameter turning carving, which is just a fabulous reflection of that experience. And those shadows are actually painted onto the surface.
Well, this is actually also one of the first very clearly narrative pieces telling a story, as opposed to a decorative piece that's pretty for its own sake.
You're right, John. Next. Hugh McKay made these pieces. Now, they're all are identical. The one on the left is made out of wood, and he cast that object in the glass, which is in the center, and bronze on the right to create this triptych. The one on the right has inlay of glass or ceramic, which is also replicated in each of the others. And this is the first triptych that he developed. He went on to create several more, but he was an early pioneer in translating your work into other materials. And he was a master at developing patterns, which later on, people like Ben Foe would go to help create molds and cast their work in the glass and other material. And this is the work of William Moore, who is a wood turner and metal spinner, and a wonderful example that's in the center's collection of a combination of those turning processes.
I just love this piece. I think this is gorgeous. I think we should pull a plug here, Albert, since we're right on 11 o'clock. And what I'm going to do is stop the share. I'm going to get back to a gallery view so I can see everybody. Suggest you all do the same. We are right up on 11 o'clock. We could take a couple of questions now. And we're going to return to Albert next week and see the second half of this slideshow. When he showed it to me the other morning, he came to me and said, this is way too long. How can we cut it? And we looked at it and said, we're not going to cut this. We're going to have to go through it. We're going to do it all. We'll just take 2 weeks. So Albert will be returning next week. But before we go, questions for Albert and comments. Floor is open.
I just want to say thank you, Albert. This is really a fabulous tour through the history of turning. Really, really well done.
I agree.
Well, it was a
Thanks,
great
Albert.
reflection, and I appreciate the opportunity. And before we go, I do want to acknowledge that all these images are part of the Center's Bressler Research Library.
Yeah, that's an incredible resource you built in Philadelphia there. It's absolutely astonishing.
Well, thank you very much. I really look forward to the second part, which I hope though doesn't turn into a third part.
No, it won't. We're going to hold you to. We'll give you one more shot here. So that's it for today, you guys. Thank you all very much for your diligent attention, as always. Always enjoyable
you.
and lots of fun. And we'll see you all
Hey,
next week.
Tina.
My better half.
Definitely.
And I'm going to end for all now, unless somebody's dying to say anything. Give them one last chance. And for
Really
all.
inspiring.
Yeah,
Great.
Thank you.
lovely stuff to see, and to see the history spread out before us. We don't understand our own history, so it's great to see it.
Good history lesson.
Thank you for this.
Nighty night,
Well,
guys.
thanks for helping create the memories.
Thank you, Albert, and everybody.
We'll see all
Thank
next-
you, Albert. Thank you, John.
we'll
That
see
was
all-
great.
Thanks. Thank you.
See you all
Bye.
next week.
Look
Bye.
forward to next week's program.
Woo.